Welcome to another broadcast of Search the Scriptures. I'm Dr. Todd Baker, director of Brit-Hadashah Ministries here in Dallas, Texas. We're glad you could be with us today as we continue our ongoing series of the problem of evil, and this will be the Resurrection Theodicy Part 2. And before we get started, let me just say that Brit-Hadashah Ministries is a twofold ministry devoted to the faithful teaching of God's Word, upholding and defending the Christian faith. And secondly, we are also a ministry that's missionary-oriented, taking the gospel back to the Jewish people in Israel, as well to all of the world. And this ministry has, for the last 25 years, been taking the gospel to the Jewish people in Israel and the Arab people. We were scheduled to go to Israel for this ministry's 60th gospel outreach, but that is hanging in doubt due to the conflict with Iran. We will know probably in the next 2 days if our outreach will go as planned, starting on April 13th. If not, then we will reschedule this outreach and get back there as soon as possible. So I'll keep you up to date on that. We also have a newsletter called Search the Scriptures. It's the quarterly newsletter of this ministry, and I hold in my hand the winter-spring 2026 edition of this newsletter. And in this current issue, we give you a report on our 59th gospel outreach to Israel. And joining me on that outreach, once again, was Dr. August Rosado of Today in Bible Prophecy. I'm having to speak a little louder because the leaf blowers are outside. Never fails every time I record. 9 times out of 10, they're out there blowing the leaves, no matter what time I choose. So it's somewhat frustrating. So please try to not let that be a distraction. So if you would like our newsletter, then you can go to our ministry website, toddbaker.org. Click on our newsletter link. You'll see all our newsletters, and email us if you want to get on our subscription list. If you want the hard copy black and white edition, then send us your name and your email address. If you want the color email edition, then give us your full name and your email address, and we'll make sure that you get that. Let me also say that we need your support. We have a tiny remnant that supports this ministry, which we're very thankful of. We're thankful that you do support our ministry, and but we do need more support. If you're interested in supporting a ministry that preaches the uncompromised Word of God, defends the faith, and follows the divine order of evangelism laid out by Jesus and the apostles, and stated in Romans 1:16, the gospel is to go to the Jew first and then the Gentile, then please consider supporting us. Every donation you make is tax deductible because we are a 501c3 ministry. And if you do want to donate, you can click on that donate link that's provided below the title of today's message, or go to toddbaker.org, and our donation link is safe, secure, and encrypted. Okay, well, this is lecture 13 in our ongoing study of the problem of evil, the Theodicy of the Resurrection, Part 2. This is a part of a course made available through Schofield Seminary. If you're interested in taking classes, good Bible-centered theology classes at Schofield Seminary, then you can enroll and earn a graduate or a doctoral level degree. If you're interested, please call our Chancellor, Dr. Daniel Woodhead, at 877-706-2479. You can also check out the school's website at www.schofieldinstitute.org. So this is part 13 of this problem of evil lecture series, and it's primarily based upon my book that I wrote, and I actually wrote this as part of my doctoral dissertation, The Eclipse of Evil, How the Cross and Resurrection Answer the Problem of Evil. This is also available at our website, toddbaker.org, for $14.95. That's one of the texts we use, the primary one. And then a secondary text that we use is The Many Faces of Evil by John S. Feinberg. So excellent resources. So we are back in giving you a Theodicy of the Cross, Part 2. A Theodicy is giving a defense and answer for why a all-loving, all-powerful, holy, good God allows evil. Evil can exist while the traditional God of theism exists at the same time. I think we've proven up to this point that philosophically and foremost biblically, that both can exist at the same time. So let's get into this. When talking about the resurrection, we're talking about a historical event that happened in reality, thus providing God's answer to the problem of evil and evil's greatest imposition on man, death. The traces or residue of the resurrection as a past historical event are available and accessible to the serious historian for honest research and investigation, not so much directly to the physically risen Christ himself, but as with science and archaeology from primary source documents, the Gospels themselves. For if the resurrection is the consummate answer to the problem of evil, both practically and especially, if the let me say that again, if the resurrection is the consummate answer to the problem of evil, both practically and empirically, it can therefore be verified as a likely event of past history by historical documents, like the eyewitness accounts found in the New Testament corpus. But how can the average person who desperately wants to believe evil is answered by the resurrection verify its facticity or plausible certainty, since there are no living witnesses alive today to interview? Well, Dr. Gary Habermas, famed conservative scholar and apologist for the physical and literal resurrection, accurately details how the contemporary historian or honest seeker can determine with reasonable certainty if the resurrection is in fact true by way of the historical documents written by the personal eyewitnesses to the events. He states, in reference to Jesus' resurrection, we are inquiring to see what we can know with reasonable historical certainty when historical inquiry is applied. Where does reasonable historical certainty start? This is a somewhat subjective question. We could place it somewhere to the right of somewhat certain and continue on to the very certain point of the spectrum. In historical inquiry, the historian combs through the data, considers all the possibilities, and seeks to determine which scenario best explains the data. Unlike an attorney, the historian often has no living witnesses available to cross-examine. Moreover, few historical witnesses may leave a record. Looking at the writings that are available, the historian may be able to examine and compare other writings that are available by the same author and perhaps his or her contemporaries to determine what the author probably meant by a certain statement. Background information and principles have helped historians uncover what happened with reasonable certainty. In another work co-authored by Habermas, he and co-author J.P. Morgan provide a graph to illustrate if an event likely happened or not in terms of historical inquiry that historians determine with regard to the degree of probability. It is expressed by the illustration of a spectrum that includes the following variables. very doubtful, quite doubtful, somewhat doubtful, uncertain, somewhat certain, quite certain, and very certain. Proof for an historical claim like the resurrection or any other event of history need not necessarily rest on apodictic certainty. Apodictic certainty means 100% certainty. Does not need to rely on that for it to have happened, but upon the degree of probability that it indeed occur. Indeed, not only does historical inquiry rest on the principles of probability, but so do the activities of living in the normal everyday world as well. This crucial point about the process and methodology of historiography is important to maintain. Why? Because whenever the claim for the deity and resurrection of Christ are made known, the unbeliever will typically respond by saying, "You expect me to give my intellectual assent and life to this, but you are not giving me absolutely certain reasons for doing so? If you want me to commit my life to doing something, the least you can do is to offer certain unquestionable proof that this is true. But for an historical event to be true, believable, and to have actually occurred does not depend upon such a stringent requirement." Now, when we talk about probability here, that is to be generally understood in terms of the established principles of belief and frequency. Thus, the idea of probability leads in two different directions: belief and frequency. Probability makes us think of the degree to which we can be confident of something certain, given what we know or can find out. Probability also makes us think of the relative frequency with which some outcome occurs on a chance setup. The certainties of whether an historical event like the resurrection occurred or not does not necessarily require that the fact of the situation merit a 100% certainty. Such a level of certainty at the apodictic level is only achievable in the most infrequent cases, or things like historiography and judicial proceeding would not be possible here, since they are established upon probabilities. That's important to remember. The standard for asserting the validity of an event rather rests, like in the process of legal cases, on establishing the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, where the evidence makes the truth of an assertion or acquittal more plausible. On this, law professor Annette Gordon-Reed further explains it this way: demanding that individual items of evidence amount to proof sets a standard that can only be met in the rarest of circumstances, either in history or in the law. The evidence must be considered as a whole before a realistic and fair assessment of the possible truth of this story can be made. To deal with the concern that accusations are easily made, whether in a legal or non-legal context, the burden of proof is normally allocated to the user. The accuser can meet the burden by offering a certain quantum of evidence, which varies depending upon the nature of the accusation. For example, in the context of legal disputes, proof beyond a reasonable doubt for criminal charges or for civil charges, proof that makes the truth of an accusation more probable than not. When such a forensic principle of probability is applied to the resurrection, scholar Robert J. Miller observes A likely scenario for how an historical event unfolded is validated when reasons for accepting it in that particular way significantly outweigh reasons for rejecting it. Miller goes on to elaborate that a finding for an historical position is essentially deduced by default. That is, there is no other reasonable way to explain the presence of the story in the text. If there are no alternate theories for an event or phenomenon of history that can equally or more adequately explain the data, then the default position accounts for its historicity. Historical scholar Grant Twelftree is quick to add that if establishing historicity is still in doubt, such does not necessarily mean that it must be discarded as unhistorical and unreliable. The historical approach does not mean that if I cannot prove historicity in any particular case, the story or elements of it must be discarded as necessarily historically unreliable. It must be stressed. We cannot move from unproven to disproven. Faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ for the justification of allowing evil by God, ultimately the greatest evil being seen in the cross, so that the greatest good can be obtained, the redemption of man and his deliverance from death via the resurrection by an all-powerful, holy, good, and loving God, is reasonable to believe based on the high probability of it being an actual historical event, given the principal evidence that was left behind. William Lane Craig defines principal evidence when observing that the principal historical basis for belief in the resurrection of Jesus consists in the evidence for the empty tomb, for the appearance of Jesus to the various witnesses, and the origin of the Christian way in the disciples coming to believe in Jesus' resurrection. If the evidence for these facts is strong and cannot be plausibly accounted for by the alternative explanations, then the resurrection of Jesus from the dead would seem to be the historical hypothesis that most suitably fits the facts of the case. The small gap that exists between absolute certainty and faith for such a theodicy is minimal and deductively bridged by practical faith. I like how Dr. John, Christian apologist, the late great Dr. John Warwick Montgomery says it. Faith is the bridge between probability and certainty. But it is here in the area of faith where many skeptics and unbelievers stop. Faith in a supernatural event seems unwarranted to the average unbeliever in Christ. But the unbeliever oftentimes fails to consider that such self-same faith is vitally necessary when operating in a contingent universe where no single thing is self-explanatory, where everything requires something else in order to provide a sufficient explanation. The problem of evil within a meaningful, lasting, and moral context is no different here. Excuse me. In such a universe, you cannot get 100% certainty as a basis for your decisions. Thus, you have to act on a measure of faith. One has no choice. Everybody has contact with faith, exercising some measure of it to function and live in the everyday world. It is a part of our ordinary existence. It is the jumping of the gap between probability and certainty. Though this is a minimalist definition of faith, it is a paradigmatic definition as a starting point. It is also a pragmatic definition as a starting point that nonetheless answers the objection of the unbeliever who requires absolute certainty for belief in the historicity of the resurrection and the final theodicy for the problem of evil. So in other words, the skeptic, the unbeliever, whoever uses faith in everyday life. When he goes and starts his car, he has the faith that that car was assembled by competent experts who know how to assemble a car so that it will work. So when you switch on the ignition, the car will start. Why? Because you believe in the evidence that people who have built that car know what they're doing. And that belief bridges the gap between that certainty and the probability when you push that ignition switch, the car will start. So why then not exercise the same kind of faith to believe in the resurrection, which rests on strong probability that it happened? To not do so shows that the unbeliever is somewhat hypocritical because he exercises faith in other areas of life, but when it comes to the supernatural event of the resurrection, he doesn't, even though he's got probabilistic evidence at hand showing that the resurrection did in fact occur. Every day in human life, people rest their total existence upon a basis of probabilities. They do so. They exercise they rest their total existence upon a basis of probabilities, which I might add, without the requirement of having 100% certainty all the time. So a person of an unbelieving inclination has no justified right to demand 100% certainty in belief, or I should say, let me state that again. So the unbeliever has no right to exercise or justify 100% certainty in behalf of religious claims, since he uses the same kind of faith in principle without a comprehensive knowledge when functioning in the ordinary world. If he does demand this, he or she is actually demanding a religion of perfect formality and pure logic. Let's face it, if they use the same skepticism in not believing in the resurrection because there's not 100% certainty per se, then why even go out of your house every day and function in society when you don't have 100% certainty that when you walk out of that door, a car doesn't hit you? But with careful and prudent steps, there is the highest probability that that will not happen to you. Although you may not be 100% certain, you still exist daily on high rate probabilities without demanding 100% certainty. Both living in a practical world based on probabilities and believing in the resurrection on the high probability it did exist. These matters, again, are not based on 100% certainty, but both of these consist in no matters of fact at all, 100% certainty. They are only relational and tell one how to put together things if one already knows that these things exist. Many non-Christians do not realize this very thing when they insist that the existence of evil is incompatible with an all-powerful, holy, good, and loving God. For unless 100% certainty is given, proving otherwise, they have already limited what religious truth could be and what it could not be based upon an unwarranted assumption that gives no cogent conclusion that the existence of evil is incompatible with the existence of the God of biblical revelation. So if you can't give 100% certainty on probabilities you rest on for daily living, then don't impose that demand of 100% certainty for the existence of the biblical God and the resurrection either. Both rest, from our perspective, on high rate probabilities. We cannot say that we were there when the resurrection event occurred, but we base our certainty on the eyewitness accounts and the transformation it produced for those who experienced it. The cross and the resurrection do provide a plausible and reasonable answer to the problem of evil, in that this all-powerful, holy, good, and loving God desires to share in our pain and suffering, and in the process defeat it and redeem us from the old order ruled by the power of evil and death. In so doing, the permission of evil serves a greater good that is accomplished by God when suffering and evil have run their course. Such a possibility fills suffering and meaning and purpose provided by the historical reality of Jesus Christ. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga entertains the following possibility from the salvific accomplishment of Jesus, that someone who suffers may then look forward to receiving the divine gratitude for taking part in this project of salvation and to enjoying forever the love and approval of God. She may then concur with Paul. We are fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him. She may thus reflect that human suffering is in no way an occasion of gratitude. Let me say that again, I misspoke. She may thus reflect that human suffering is, in a way, an occasion of gratitude. There is another way in which it is perhaps an occasion for gratitude. It is plausible to think that the best possible worlds God could have actualized contained the unthinkably great good of divine incarnation and redemption, but then, of course, also sin and suffering. God chooses one of these worlds to be actual, and in it, humankind suffers. Still, in this world, there is also the marvelous opportunity for redemption and for eternal fellowship with God, an inconceivably great good that vastly outweighs the suffering we are called upon to endure. Still further, in being offered eternal fellowship with God, we human beings are invited to join in the charmed circle of the Trinity itself, fellowship with the Trinity, and perhaps that invitation can be issued only to creatures who have fallen, suffered, and been redeemed. If so, the condition of humankind is vastly better than it would have been had there been no sin and suffering. The argument against the resurrection, and all miracles for that matter, made famous by David Hume and revived by the late 20th century resurgence of naturalistic explanations for the supernatural and miraculous, rests on the materialistic assumption that we live in a closed universe where an outside supernatural intervention by a divine agent is simply not tenable, since the laws of nature by routine observance teach that there is a firm and unalterable experience against miracles. Hume's rejection of miracles and supernatural intervention that is antecedent to them was sufficiently refuted by it was refuted. Hume's discounting of miracles was sufficiently refuted shortly after Hume's lifetime in the 18th century by Christian philosophers William Paley, Gottfried Lessing, and George Campbell, who wrote extensive works showing that Hume's arguments against the miraculous were largely circuitous and logically untenable. Modern-day philosophers have also thoroughly refuted Hume's position as erroneous and a mere begging of the question. Richard Swinburne's The Concept of Miracle and John Earman's Bayes, Hume, and Miracles are good modern-day refutations of Hume's circular argument that miracles don't exist because he already assumes from the outset we live in a closed universe of unalterable experiences. Thus, the hasty conclusion is that miracles, like the resurrection, cannot occur, and therefore we are left once again with the problem of evil. For Hume and the modern critic, no physical resurrection from the dead is likely, since experience teaches by observance that people die and stay dead. This is the firm and unalterable experience of natural law with regard to death and dying. But the rejection of the resurrection on the grounds that people die and therefore remain dead is only the mere product of circular reasoning that produces only a tautology in the end. And while it is true that everyone who has lived has died, that is a 99.9% certainty. Notice I didn't say 100%. Up to this point, that is a 99.9% certainty. That 1% leaves out, or does not leave out, I should say, the resurrection, which does not make it 100% that every person who lives dies. There's one exception, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But those who assumed a naturalistic worldview and we live in a closed universe, that for them means they automatically preclude a resurrection based upon their circular reasoning that assumes miracles can't happen because, of course, we live in a closed universe. The assertion that the dead remains dead is only the observation of general experience most of the time. It is not literally the product of firm, unalterable experience unless a person has checked out any and all claims of people dying and not staying dead. In light of this glaring fact, the individual will have to revise the general statement of unalterable experience. Thus, in general, people who die stay dead, with one very important and unique exception: Jesus Christ, who was raised from death, empirically verified by those eyewitnesses that observed and spent time with him. Experiment and observation, utilized by checking of the particulars, must precede and criticize generalizations. No one, especially man with his finite limits and restricted epistemic accessibility, can dogmatically declare that there is a universal and unalterable experience against anything. The universe, indeed, is a very complex place and thus poses many difficulties. Because the universe is so complex, one cannot rule out events that defy normal routine explanation, that one can investigate certain claims about the events. If one precludes such investigative inquiry outside of religious or supernatural claims, the person suddenly discovers that it destroys innovation, which forces us to an impossible conservatism that makes newness impossible. The physical reality of the resurrection is not only an historical event, but also an event that transcends history, like the nature of miracle itself, whose origin lies in God, who exists above and beyond the three-dimensional space-time continuum of our history. Thus, the resurrection is partly beyond the scope of physical history to ascertain, because God, who is the direct cause of it, lies beyond the scope of physical history. Faith must therefore unite with what has happened in history in order to embrace the theodical aspect of the resurrection. But unless the average historian accounts for the sui generis nature of the resurrection event, he or she will dismiss it as illusory, misunderstood, or reputed to have happened by a band of misled and deluded followers that cannot possibly be verified today. This leads Christian apologist Ronald Nash to observe, like every other miracle, the resurrection has a dimension beyond history. Its cause, God, is outside history. It is a case of transcendence intervening in history. But though there is a transhistorical dimension to the resurrection is not a simple historical event. The very nature of a miracle takes it outside the ordinary realm of cause and effect, which are the proper province of historical investigation. The historian qua historian doesn't know what to do with a miracle, an event that has a cause outside of history. The reason why history can provide only partial support for the resurrection is that some aspects of it are historically verifiable and some are not. In the final analysis, our assent to the resurrection must involve both history and faith. There will always be an aspect of the resurrection that transcends what history can discover and prove. In order for the problem of evil to be practically and empirically addressed in the world of humanity, the resurrection has to have a sense of objectivity, both from a physical aspect and also an observation made by those in the real, literal moment of time. Since evil is an intrusive and oppressive reality in the space-time dimension of this present world order, the answer to it must correspondingly occur in the same arena and time frame in order to be really efficacious. This certainly does not rule out faith in the process as some replacement or surrogate to fill in the lack of objectivity the miracle of the resurrection lacks by those incredulous to its physical facticity. Faith comes after one examines the historical data of the simple and unvarnished gospel accounts about the resurrection event. Faith in the resurrection as the final answer to evil must occur personally and experientially for the person via the act of belief and faith commitment to the saving act of God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which indeed rests on the same reliable probabilities as any historical event in the classical world. Christian apologist and scholar Dr. John Warwick Montgomery states the case well in this vein when addressing the nature of the Christian faith and historical reliability. He notes, "I say only that the historical probabilities are comparable to those of other events of classical times. Therefore, there is an excellent objective ground to which to tie the religion that Jesus sets forth. Final validation of this can only come experientially, but it is desperately important not to put ourselves in such a position that the event nature of the resurrection depends wholly upon the faith. In other words, it has to have an objective historical content to it. Montgomery continues. Let me just repeat what he said. But it is desperately important not to put ourselves in such a position that the event nature of the resurrection depends wholly upon the faith. It's the other way around. The faith has its starting point in the event, the objective event, and only by the appropriation of this objective event do we discover the final validity of it. The appropriation is the subjective element, and this must not enter into the investigation of the event. If it does, the Christian faith is reduced to irrelevant circularity. The Christian faith is built upon gospel that is good news, and there is no news, good or bad, of something that didn't happen. I personally am much disturbed by certain contemporary movements in theology which seem to imply that we can have faith regardless of whether anything happened or not. I believe absolutely that the whole Christian faith is premised upon the fact that at a certain point of time under Pontius Pilate, a certain man died and was buried, and 3 days later rose from the dead. If in some way you could demonstrate to me that Jesus never lived, died, or rose again, then I would have to say I have no right to my faith. So many of those skeptics, like Dr. Montgomery, like Lee Strobel, like Josh McDowell, all Christian apologists, were former atheists who did not believe in the supernatural elements of the Christian faith. So when challenged to do so, they carefully investigated the very hinge upon which Christianity turns. That would be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when they approached it initially skeptically, but with an objective mind, they realized that the historical evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated that Jesus Christ indeed rose from the dead. And in that honesty that they had, they realized that it was true, and that elicited saving faith, belief in Jesus Christ, who he is and what he did. And the Lord Jesus, in fact, answers the problem of evil leading into our greatest enemy, death, by the death knell of the resurrection, an event, an historical event that has much validity, as any person or event in classical history, which has also been factually verified. The resurrection is indeed an objective, factual occurrence. And what does that mean for you and I? It means that Jesus Christ, God through Jesus Christ, has entered into our universe, stepped from eternity into time, lived on this earth, confronted evil and its byproducts, suffering, pain, and yes, ultimately death, and conquered them once for all by the cross and resurrection. And the only way that you can be saved from the thrall of the problem of evil is placing your trust in the one crucified, the innocent, sinless God-man who died for the punishment of your sins and releases to you from the Father forgiveness, reconciliation, and adoption into God's forever family with Jesus Christ's perfect righteousness given to you. That, my friend, is the gospel, which is the only effective, exclusive, and final answer to the problem of evil. The resurrection is God's yes to the cross of Jesus Christ and the vindication and declaratory defeat of evil and death. Put your trust in this crucified Messiah, and you too shall be saved from the problem of evil. Well, until next time, Shalom, Yeshua HaMashiach Aleichem. May the peace of Jesus the Messiah be with you.